Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Maxwell's House is brought to you by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Maxwell's House with Ray Maxwell and Dr. Kiki Sanford. Episode 58, Printing Color.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Kiki, and it's time for Maxwell's House with Ray Maxwell. He's here on Skype. It's episode number 58, Printing in Color. Are you ready, Ray?
All set. Yes, this is the third in our series of shows on color. Our first one was kind of the basics of human perception in color. The second one was on RGB color and monitors. And today we're going to talk about how do we print that color out and how does all this stuff work and how do we get the correct colors and so forth. And I've got a few introductory things that I want to go through before we dive into that. But that's going to be the main topic of the show today.
That sounds really interesting. I've been going through some color printing issues myself, so this is going to be very timely. And so I'm going to be paying close attention, and hopefully we'll be able to take home some information that I can use. So I'm all ready. I'm all ready to get started.
Super. Well, I'll do my best. I just wanted to, before we get deep into that, say that I've had some wonderful feedback from the 3D Technology Show. Many of our listeners have sent me additional links, additional information about 3D technology. I appreciate that. And all of the audience feedback that I've heard from. Of course, they can contact me at ray@twit.tv. And we've got a wonderfully supportive audience, and I always enjoy hearing what they've got to say and them pointing me at new ideas and questions they have about things on the show. Another, this is a completely aside, this is a plea for iPhone developers. I have noticed that the iPhone, the iPhone could set its clock by three different means. It could use the cell phone system, which sends out a time signal to all cell phones. It could use the internet via Wi-Fi and go to one of the time-based stations. And this, by the way, this is triggered, of course, by one of your programs.
Excellent.
Yes. And but the most accurate way it could set its clock, and it apparently doesn't do this, is through the GPS. Because if you have a GPS and you are listening to those satellite signals, it's certainly possible to set your clock accurate to less than 1/100th of a second. And occasionally, I notice the clock on my iPhone can be out by as much as 2 or 3 seconds from the GPS time, which again is the most accurate because it knows where you are, it knows the time that it takes the propagation delays, and so it can set very, very accurately. And so I'm hoping somebody will write an application that will do that.
Yeah, maybe putting it out there, maybe somebody in the Twit audience will find that an interesting project.
Exactly. I haven't seen an application that does that, but I think there'd be a demand for it.
More and greater accuracy all the time. Go for it.
All the time. Well, after your show, we want nothing but.
Exactly.
I've got to digress for a Ray Maxwell story. After listening to your show, and we're referring to Dr. Kiki's Science Hour and a show on time standards, and they had a gentleman from the standards division who gets time very, very accurately. And he mentioned cesium time bases and rubidium time bases. I had a very good friend that used to go through the surplus stores in San Francisco, and I was with him one day, and we found a Hewlett-Packard rubidium time source.
Oh, fun.
And the owner of the surplus told him, he said, hey, if you want that thing, I'll let you have it really cheap, because he said, I think that it's the rubidium tube itself, which I believe at that time was $18,000 to replace. And he said, I believe it's
change.
Yeah, I believe that it's the tube that's burnt out. So if you want that thing, I'll sell it to you for $200 just for parts. And he says, do you have the manual? And he said, yeah, I do. He said, fine. He said, the manual's another $5. Fine. He said, I'll buy it. So for $205, he took this thing home, opened up the manual, opened up the device, worked on it a while, found the 25-cent resistor that had burned out, replaced it, and had a working rubidium time source.
That's a good story.
Yes.
That is awesome. So an $18,000 plus thing, this rubidium source, and then to 25 cents for a transistor. That's awesome.
It was a resistor that had burned out.
Resistor. That's fantastic.
Yeah, found that, and now he owns his own very accurate rubidium time source.
I love it.
Anyway, another announcement I've got is Canada now, who had really slapped on some very stringent no carry-on baggage and all that. They have rescinded those at long last.
Oh, have they? So what are the new restrictions? Are there any new restrictions, or is it just lifting of those terrible restrictions?
I think I'm not sure that the hour before landing you can't get up. I think that's still in place, but you can carry on a bag now, and they've kind of gotten reasonable. In that light, the other night I had the privilege of going to the Vancouver Community College, and their guest speaker was Dr. Gwen Dyer, and I have mentioned him before. And if you haven't read one of his books or listened to one of his podcasts or heard him on CBC in Canada, I highly advise you to go out there and find something by him and read it. The guy, in my opinion, is brilliant. If you go to, if you want to know about what he thinks of airport security, go to straight.com. That's the Georgia Straight newspaper here in Vancouver. And it's straight.com, and search on Gwen Dyer, and his name is spelled GWYNNEDYER, and airport, and you'll find a story from him about what he thinks of the current security situation. Keep in mind that this guy is a PhD and has been an advisor to 3 navies in the U.S. And Canada and Great Britain, and has his PhD is in Middle Eastern history and political science, and he has been an advisor to the military, like I say, in 3 different countries, and is quite a brilliant guy. But the other website to visit is gwendyer.com. Now, that's run together. Again, that's GWYNNEDYER.com. And right on the heading, or right under that, you'll see podcast ideas. Ideas is a CBC radio program, and there's numbers 1, 2, and 3. Each of those is a 1-hour podcast by Gwen Dyer, and it's entitled Climate Wars, and it is a must listen. He also has written a book by that title, and
you can see here that he's got a book. Great.
Right. And in a nutshell, let me just say that he has many friends in the military as an advisor to the military in 3 countries, and they are all making plans for how they will repel starving people from climate change from crossing our borders. Or
that is something that people are really starting to think about, because climate change is going to cause huge problems in terms of where people are located, especially people who are located in low-lying areas as the water rises.
And in addition, there's going to be a great shortage of water in the tropic and subtropic areas.
Yeah, and areas that once used to be fed off of glacier melt will not be anymore. It's going to be a completely different world.
And there's the Tibetan Plateau, which feeds the rivers of both through India to Pakistan. And if somebody cuts off the water there, they're both armed with nuclear weapons. So
that sounds like fun.
Now, let me just point out, I mean, some people are saying, well, I don't buy into climate change and all that. let me point out that in North America, there is an aquifer that runs from Canada all the way down through the Midwest of the U.S., and that aquifer, the level of it, it is very, very old water. And the level of it is lowering and lowering due to irrigation and crop growing. And nature is not replacing that water. So, forget about the tropics and all that. There's going to be a shortage of water, according to the science studies, in the Ocklawaha aquifer, I believe it's called. It's an Indian name. I can't pronounce it. But all I'm saying is if you want to know more about all those topics, go listen to those podcasts. He talks about all of them, and it is worth your time to have a listen. All right. So that's my potpourri for the day.
Great potpourri.
Yeah.
That's good.
And now we're going to jump into printing color from your computer. We're going to focus primarily on inkjet printing. And my opening remark is your school teacher lied when she told you that the primary colors were red, blue, and yellow.
No. Say it isn't so, Ray. Just say it isn't so.
I don't know. I remember. I think it was, third grade or something. I opened my crayons and got out the red, blue, and yellow, and I scribbled them over. I was supposed to get black, and I got kind of a muddy brown or something.
I'm missing something. That ultimate black is just not happening. What is going on here? What am I missing?
Precisely. But anyway, last week we talked about how monitors produce color, and of course, the week before we talked about the fact that the eye, we'll just review a moment, the eye has receptors in it that are sensitive primarily to red, green, and blue light. It isn't quite that simple, but for first order approximation, we'll talk about it in those terms. So if you want to make the eye see all the colors that it can perceive, we can vary the mixture of red, green, and blue light that we send into the eye. And by mixing those in various amounts, we can make the eye perceive any color. Now then, and that's exactly what a monitor does. It has a red, green, and a blue phosphor, a red, green, and blue filter in the case of LCD. And by varying the strength of the signal to those individual pixels, we can vary the intensity of the red, blue, and green sensation and make your eye see all the different colors. Mm-hmm. When it comes to printing, we have a different problem. If I put a piece of white paper in front of you on the desk, what wavelengths of light does it reflect?
It reflects the entire spectrum, doesn't it?
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
It reflects the entire incident light that falls on it. Mm-hmm. Now then, let's imagine that we want to control the amount of red, green, and blue light that is reflected from that white piece of paper. So what we would like is we'd like some kind of dye that would control, or pigment, that would control individually so that we can vary the mixture, the amount of red, green, and blue light that is reflected from that white piece of paper. Now, let's just jump in there like we didn't know any better, and let's just use red, green, and blue dyes and see what happens. If we put down a red dye on a piece of paper, let's analyze what's happening. If we see red light reflected from a red dye, it is absorbing the green and blue light that the white paper a moment ago was reflecting.
Aha.
All right?
Yeah.
So it's only reflecting one color of light, and it's absorbing two colors. Now, after we put down the red, if we put down green over it, what's green dye doing? Green dye would be absorbing red and blue and reflecting only green. Well, now the red dye we just put down, we already said that it absorbs green and blue. And if we put a red dye over it, and it absorbs only the red's left. If it absorbs red, what color do we see with just two dyes? We get black.
Black.
Because it's absorbing all the light that fell on the white paper. So using red, green, and blue dyes doesn't work because they absorb two of the colors of light.
And not the third.
Yeah, and reflect the third. Yeah. So as soon as we lay down any two of those colors, we get black. So that doesn't work too well. So what do we need to control red, green, and blue reflection from the white paper? Well, it turns out that if we lay down a dye that we call cyan dye, what it does is it absorbs red and reflects blue and green. And of course, the color cyan, that's what we usually refer to as blue and green mixed. And if we're talking about on our monitor, if we, turned on the blue and green guns or LED pixels, we would see cyan. So if we take a dye and put it down on paper, it will reflect the blue and green and absorb only red. So by the way, these colors we call the subtractive colors because what we're trying to do is subtract some portion of the spectrum as it's being reflected from the white paper.
Right.
So the first color that we need is cyan, which controls red.
Which is the C.
Yeah.
In your CMY.
Which is the C in CMY.
Right.
All right. So cyan is minus red. All right?
Yep.
If we go to the next color, what do we want to do? We want to control green. Well, how do we control green? Well, we want to reflect the red and blue and absorb green. Well, if you mix red and blue, which are at opposite ends of the spectrum, we get that color that only exists in your brain.
That you talked about last week, right? Magenta. Nice.
So that's CM.
Got it.
And then the next thing we want to do is we want to control blue. And to control blue, we have to reflect the red and green and absorb blue. Well, red and green mixed together makes yellow. So we now have CMY, cyan, magenta, and yellow. Those are the subtractive primaries. Cyan is minus red. The more cyan dye we lay down, the more red we subtract. The more magenta dye we lay down, the more green we subtract. The more yellow dye we lay down, we subtract blue. So there we have it. Now, somebody always comes along in one of my talks at this time and says,
"You're missing something."
What's the K at the end? All right. And it turns out,
yeah. What color starts with a K?
Yeah, exactly. And that's and I say, oh, well, the K is the black channel, and then they say, why do you call it K? Black doesn't, And I said, well, we already used B in RGB, so.
Got it.
No, actually, there is a very, very rational explanation.
Which I'm hoping you're going to come out with right now.
Yeah.
Okay,
and
good.
right now.
Good.
If you go into a printing shop where they do offset printing, they have to register the printing plates. And what they do is they lay down the black channel first, and then they register the other three colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow, to the black channel. And because it is the first one that they adjust everything to, it's called the key channel. It is the key channel. They key on the black channel, and that's why it's called K.
K for key, the keying channel.
Right. Because they register everything else to the key channel, which happens to be the one that contains the black ink.
And all of this makes sense. You just have to learn the logic and the nomenclature behind it. And it's not, and even the nomenclature, so these colors being subtractive colors. I mean, this all logically makes sense when you think of it in a progressive viewpoint, the way you've presented it here.
Right. Well, you have to, the first step is that when we were dealing with monitors and projectors, those are emissive devices. They can emit the red, green, and blue. But when we have a blank piece of white paper and it's reflecting all the wavelengths of light, how do we go in and control that red, green, and blue channel that our eye responds to? And we do it with these subtractive dyes or pigments, cyan, magenta, yellow. Now, next question I get is, well, why do you need black? Can't you just mix cyan, magenta, and yellow together and get black? And the answer is do you remember that stuff we used to use a long time ago called film?
I remember this thing called film. Yes.
Precisely. Well,
I actually think I still might have some of some old film canisters
right.
that I just never took to get developed, and now it's too late.
Yep, there you go. Well, Kodak and Fuji and all those people that made those films for our cameras back a few years ago.
They still make it.
Yes, that's true.
It still
they
exists.
Do.
Yes.
You still can buy it. You have to look around now. But they spared no expense because they're laying down very thin films, and they created very super pure cyan, magenta, and yellow dyes. And in film and photographic printing paper, they do, in fact, produce black with nothing but CMY. If you go and, chemically analyze the layers in a piece of photographic film, you will find, after it's processed, you will find dyes of cyan, magenta, and yellow dyes in there there's no black channel. So photography, film, does indeed use nothing but CMY, but those dyes are very expensive. And if you're creating a little 35 millimeter piece of film that's coated with those dyes, you can afford. Now, if you think inkjet ink is expensive, think about what you paid for a single frame of film nowadays.
And this is an interesting question that you might be getting to later, the difference between the component chemicals that are in the old film versus printing dyes. Heavy metals were the basis of the colors of those pigment dyes for film, weren't they?
Now, film did not use
not pigment dyes, but
they were organic.
Organic. Okay.
Yes, the dyes used in film were from organic sources, and in fact, I used to die laughing at this. I used to develop my own slides, and the last chemical bath that I put the slide in was formaldehyde. That's
not good.
No.
That's a fixative. I used to do that. I used to use formaldehyde to fix small animal brains.
Precisely. Anybody that's worked in biology knows all about formaldehyde, and they know about the headaches you can get from it and so forth. But the last bath of ectochrome processing was formaldehyde to set the organic dyes. That
don't
goes
inhale.
back.
Just don't. You want to use that stuff under a fume hood, right? You could be affecting brain cells just by inhaling. That's
true. That's probably what's wrong with me today. But
might explain a lot about both of us.
Right. But at any rate, those dyes were very expensive. And if you, figure out how little dye, it's a very little thin film in there. And like I say, if you think inkjet ink is expensive, think about what you were paying for a thin film of dye inside some of those films.
Yeah.
But they could afford, because people would pay it for that kind of thing. Now, when you print magazines, people don't like to pay that much for it. And so they use pigment dyes now instead of organic dyes. And those pigment dyes, some of the early ones did, in fact, use heavy metals, but they have gone away from those in the printing industry. The printing industry has become very pollution-minded, and they have developed new pigments that don't have carcinogens in them and so forth.
Yeah, well, if you know so many of your pages are going to end up in landfills or places where they could be leaching out into the water supply, that's something you should be concerned about.
Right, and the printers today are very concerned about that, and the printing ink manufacturers and so forth. They have done a lot of work in that area, and they're much less toxic today than they were, years ago. But at any rate, the only thing is when you save money on those dyes, when you're printing 1,000,000 magazines or pigments in this case, they aren't as spectrally pure as the ones used in film. And if you mix the typical printing pigments that are used on a printing press together, CMY, 100% of each, you get a muddy brown. You don't get a crisp black. And so in order to get a nice crisp black, they added this fourth channel, the black. And anywhere there's shadows or deep dark colors, they print black in there to get that. And I don't think I'm going to go deep into this, but I'm just going to say they have two families of algorithms. One called UCR, undercolor removal, which is just adding black in the shadows. And then they have another algorithm they use for formulating the CMYK mix called GCR, which is gray component removal. And in that one, what they do is they look at how much cyan, magenta, and yellow is being used just to produce a neutral gray, in like a mid-tone gray.
Yeah.
And they start subtracting out the three inks simultaneously, CMY, until one goes to 0. Mm-hmm. And then they put in black ink to add the extra density that it would have been produced by the 3 CMYs. So that's gray component. You remove the gray component being produced by the CMY mix.
And add in black.
Add in black. And by the way, black ink is cheaper than the colored inks. So GCR printing saves money. And again, if you're printing 1,000,000 magazines,
you want to save money. You're
right.
going to do it this way, yes.
So now then, that brings up another problem. If we're going to print on paper, there was a process years ago that was in vogue for a while called dye sublimation printing. And dye sublimation printing is quite interesting. The way it was done is you had a white sheet. It usually actually had a plastic base, and you laid a ribbon over it that contained the dye for dye sublimation printing. And you had to cover the entire page in a cyan ribbon, a yellow ribbon, a magenta ribbon, and a black ribbon. And so whether or not, if you printed a single dot of cyan, you had to cover the entire page with this. And then you brought a printing head in contact with the ribbon on the back side, and it had heaters in it. And it would be at like 300 DPI. There'd be a little bitty heater in there, 300 of them per inch, and that heater would heat up this ribbon, and it would cause the dye that was on the ribbon to vaporize into a vapor and then condense out or sublimate onto the paper backing. And now that's dye sublimation. Now the beauty of dye sublimation
is you can make lots of stickers with it.
Yeah, but it's continuous tone. In other words, you can, on a single pixel on the page, you can print any amount of cyan, magenta, and yellow dye and lay it down as a vapor. So you can lay down a very thin, very low density spot of cyan, magenta, yellow, or black ink. And you can lay one right on top of the other and mix them together because of this gaseous nature of how it's laid down.
Right.
So that was continuous tone printing. So you could take a file that was destined for a monitor with their RGB values, invert it, okay, so that you're going to subtract out the proper amount of red, green, and blue, and send it to those cyan, magenta, yellow channels, and it would, heat up and drive off the appropriate amount of dye, and you would get if you said, hey, I just want a little bit of cyan, it'd put a little in. If you wanted all of it on, it would lay down all of the pigment from the ribbon. Okay, now the downside of that process is because these ribbons are so big, they're as big as the sheet of paper you're printing on, they're very expensive. It's a very expensive process because essentially you have to have enough dye there to print a solid cyan, magenta, and yellow over the whole page, whether or not you want it or not. So somebody said, well, a better idea was if we'd come along with an inkjet and we'd only put down ink when we need to. But, big but here, there's a problem. When you print with an inkjet or an offset press, you only have two choices. You either lay down a dot of ink and the density of it is 100%, or you don't.
Right.
So this then begs the problem: how are we going to, lay down shades of gray or shades of cyan, magenta, and yellow? How are we going to control our density?
Yep.
So in the printing industry, we use what's called screening. And there are two kinds of screens. And in the vernacular, in the printing industry, we talk about them as AM screens and FM screens. And the color scientists would talk about them as periodic screens and stochastic screens. So let's examine them. If you get an old newspaper and you look at a picture in it, it's not hard at all, even with your eye. If you hold it up close or a magnifying glass, you can see it's made up of a bunch of dots. And the way they gave your eye the illusion of shades of gray was to vary the size of the dots. So they would lay down a pattern of dots. If a newspaper typically was 75 to 100 dots per inch, and they would lay those dots on the paper. And if they wanted a mid-tone gray, they would make the dots large enough to fill up half of the area they wanted to be gray. And so your eye would mix the black dots with the white paper background showing between them and make you see gray, make your brain see gray. So that's AM screening. Now, it turns out that to do AM screening, you have to lay down the dots very, very, very precisely. If you don't lay them on that grid perfectly, you'll get what's called banding. And because if you push one line of dots closer together than the next line or space them out, you'll suddenly see, your eye will pick up very quickly banding. So on an offset press, this worked fine. But the early inkjet printers, when you spray those little droplets of ink out towards the paper, depending on the temperature and the humidity, it's very hard to lay down the dots accurately.
Yep.
And so the early inkjet printers, if they tried to print using an AM screen and vary the dot size, which is also hard to do on an inkjet printer, and next to impossible, actually, you would get banding, and you couldn't vary the dot size. So they came up with a technique called stochastic screening, or FM screening. And what they did is, instead of varying the size of the dots in AM screening, they varied the space between the dots. So the lighter shade, you would space the dots out, and the darker shade, you would put the dots in very close together. And this would, again, fool your eye into seeing gray. And it was very important that you randomly place those dots and produce this stochastic effect so that you don't get any banding. And that's, to this day, that's the way all inkjet printers do their screening, is with stochastic screening.
That's a neat trick. I like knowing how that's happening. That's really neat. And so it's using the way that we pick up light and the way that we see and what our brain can differentiate between, and these white spaces, between the white spaces and the colored spaces, and what those colors are, to allow us to actually see these mixes of colors.
Precisely. That's exactly it. We just put dots down on the page close enough together that fools our brain and our eye into integrating those into shades of gray or shades of cyan, magenta, and yellow. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that, then we can produce any color that we want with an inkjet printer. So that's the way, in a nutshell, that's the way our inkjet printers work on our computers today. Now, when I talked about monitors, I mentioned that if you were at all serious, you needed a colorimeter, which is a 3-channel device. It has a red, green, and blue channel. And it allows you to calibrate your monitor to set the gamma. And I explained what that was last week on your monitor.
So
And you want-
episode 57, if anybody's interested in understanding the colorimeter and the gamma channel,
Right.
go back and listen.
And you want to set your gamma to 2.2, and that's for Windows and Mac now. With Snow Leopard, Apple finally let go of Gamma 1.8, which they never should have. They should have let go of it 10 years ago. But at any rate, they did it. And then, in addition, the colorimeter allows you to profile the monitor. And what profiling is, just reviewing, is it measures the actual color coming out, measures the energy of red, green, and blue, and maps it into LAB color space, which is a model of human perception. It involves a bunch of math, but the software that comes with the puck does it all, so you don't have to worry about it. And then when we have an LAB set of numbers, we know exactly what color we need to reproduce on the monitor, and we can feed that LAB color into our monitor profile that we've made custom for our monitor, and it will output the correct RGB value for our specific monitor. So the next question is, okay, we understand how we get correct color and consistent color on our monitor. How do we do that for the printer?
Yeah,
Well-
how do you get the consistent color, and how do you get the color that comes out of the printer to match the color that you see on your screen?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Last week, again, just reviewing, we took a RGB file and we put a tag in it saying this is in, let's say, Adobe 98 color space. And so that we took the RGB values out of the file, ran them through that tag, this profile, ICC profile, and we ran RGB values in and we got out LAB. Then from LAB, which describes the color in human perception terms of what we want on the screen, it then goes through the monitor profile and goes in as LAB, comes out as RGB for that specific monitor. We have to do the same thing for our inkjet printer. So we'd have the file that has RGB values in it. And by the way, most of the printers today, inkjet printer manufacturers, do the RGB to CMYK conversion inside the printer or the printer driver. So most of the time in a computer, you are sending RGB values out to your printer driver, and then it does the conversion of inverting and figuring out what makes a CYMK. But the profile for the printer is an RGB profile. So again, we take the file that has RGB values in it, we run it through the, let's say, the Adobe 98 profile, we get out LAB, which is telling us in real terms what color we want to reproduce. We then take the LAB, put it into the printer profile, and it outputs RGB values that must be sent to your specific printer in order to produce the LAB value or the color that you want on the printer. So that's how we get a close match between monitors and printers. To get an exact match between your monitor and your printer, you need to have your printer very careful, or your monitor very carefully calibrated. Your print, when you view it, has to be in a controlled lighting condition, because the incident light will change the appearing colors that you see. And you have to be in a room with gray walls, and you have to wear a black shirt. And now, this is what people who do very precise color management and color science do. Now, let me tell you the good news.
I love it.
Today, most of the printers, the Epsons, the Canons, the Hewlett-Packards, they have done some really outstanding work in the hardware to keep the printers printing consistently. Because in the past, that was the problem. Because every time the temperature or the humidity varied, spitting these little inkjet globs out through the air, if the humidity changed, the printer would not behave consistently. They now have chips inside the printers that measure the temperature and the humidity, and they adjust how it's spraying out the droplets to keep the color consistent within, certain limits.
Right.
Now, they also make very, very good canned profiles for the printers. A person who pioneered in that was Bill Atkinson. He made some of the, he was an early Mac, wrote the early Mac software for the Mac Plus and so forth. And by the way, he's a neuroscientist. He had a PhD in neuroscience before he started writing software.
Yeah, you've brought him up before, I believe. Yeah.
And so he was well equipped to understand human perception. And so he made some of the best color profiles for the early Epson printers. Now, Epson since then has gone on to make excellent profiles themselves. And if you buy an Epson printer today, it will come with a set of profiles for each of the papers they use and each of the ink sets that are available for that particular printer. And a lot of third-party paper manufacturers now will also supply you with pre-made profiles. And in my opinion today, those profiles are very good, and in many cases, they're better than you could make if you did it yourself. But somebody always says, Ray, I want to do it myself. How do I do it? So that's what we're going to cover right now.
This is the how-to section of Ray Maxwell's House on Printing Color.
If you want to make your own printer profiles, you can't use a colorimeter. You have to use a spectrophotometer. And the reason why is because monitors are fairly well-behaved devices, and the color characteristics of the filters and the phosphors that are used in CRTs and LCDs are very well known. So people can use a 3-channel device, which a colorimeter is, that just measures red, green, and blue, and they can make corrections for a specific model of monitor, and they can get very, very close with those wideband devices. But printers, that isn't true. The spectral properties of the inks used by the different printer manufacturers vary all over the place. And so you need a 24 or 32 channel spectrophotometer. So what's a spectrophotometer? Well, it's a device that divides the spectrum into 10 nanometer slices and measures how much energy is being reflected. First of all, it puts a controlled amount of light down on the photograph that you're measuring, and then it measures in 10 channel steps how much energy is coming back. And then they take those individual readings, those 24 or 32 readings, and they map them into the thing I referred to in the first show, the color matching functions of the human eye, and they get out an X, Y, Z value, and then through math, that is turned into LAB. So a spectrophotometer is a 24 or 32 channel device, not a 3-channel device like a colorimeter. And it can, again, predict how the human eye is going to respond to the pigments and reflections of those dyes or pigments on your photographic paper that came out of your inkjet printer. So that's what a spectrophotometer is. And if you want to make your own, you're going to have to buy a spectrophotometer. The least expensive one is the Color Monkey, and it's around $500. And if you are a super-duper professional or a printing house, you're looking at $5,000 to $10,000 for a high-quality spectrophotometer and the software that goes with it.
Wow. So it's an investment. If you really want to get into accurate color printing, you're going to lay down some cash.
Right. Now, the software has gotten much better, and the so-called automatic profiles that the spectrophotometers make today are much better than when I worked in the field. When I worked in this field, you ran it through the software and everything, and then you hand edited each part of the spectrum to get the profile correct. And I have in the past spent a month to 2 months tuning custom profiles to get them good enough that a very high-end printing house will accept the inkjet prints as proofs of what the press is going to do. In other words, I had to exactly match the performance of a press with a inkjet printer. And it turns out that that's quite involved and quite difficult. So what I'm saying is, unless you're an absolute fanatic on this, use the canned profiles that come with your printer. It'll get you very close, and it'll certainly get you in the right ballpark. So that is, what we wanted to talk about today. Next week,
I think that's some pretty good advice, actually. That it's good to know that Epson has and other printers have actually done the work to get you color profiles that are good enough for the average person. They're fine. If you really want to get into it, you can get into these much more involved processes that are going to be a bit expensive.
Right.
Yeah.
And like I say, the software and that comes with the Color Monkey and so on is much better than the software I was using 5 or 7 years ago. So what I'm saying is the automatic, you won't have to tune them for a month today, but right. you still may have to do some tuning if you're very, very, trying to do very, very critical color matches.
Yeah. And do they shift much over time? I mean, have you found that over time the values shift, and so you have to constantly be calibrating, or is this something that you can calibrate once and just kind of leave it for a while?
Well, you still should check your calibration. Again, if you're very, very, doing critical color work, you need to check it at least once a month. But again, for the average amateur, if you use the manufacturer's ink sets, that's important. Mm-hmm. Third-party inks. I know we all hate to pay the price for the ink. Oh, let me
and
show you.
You're not even getting into the buying separate individual pigments for your printers. I mean, people can go really involved, and you can actually get pigment sets that for really color printing if you're doing some involved stuff.
I'll tell you the only way I've found to save money on printer ink, and I have a Epson 4000, which is a fairly dated printer now. There's a 4880 out that's much better. But it's a large format printer. It'll print up to 17 inches wide. And but when I buy the ink cartridges for it, I buy 220 milliliter ink cartridges. Okay.
Let me get close
and
up
these
there.
are really big.
It is, and there's single color cartridges for
That's a single color cartridge, and I have to have 8 of them. And if I go out and pay list price, I'm paying about $120 a cartridge. However, that'll last me for a year of printing. So, when it comes to, I can print a 1620 paper and ink for about $5. So it's not too bad. And it costs more if you use the smaller printers and smaller ink supplies. But I highly recommend if you want to use those profiles and have them be accurate, you need to use the manufacturer's paper, the manufacturer's ink set, or there are some very nice papers out there from a whole lot of third-party companies, but they give you a profile, again, for a specific ink set.
Right, because as we were talking about from the beginning of the show, you're dealing with the reflectivity of the particular paper that you're using, and then the mixes of dyes that have to cover that up.
Right. But back to the drifting, the printers are extremely stable today because of these special sensors built into the printers and the special chips that and the way the heads are designed today. It's really, there's been millions and millions of dollars spent on research getting these drop-on-demand inkjet printers working as consistently as they do. It's amazing technology, and the price they produce them at is amazing. I worked in the field of continuous inkjet printers, which start at $50,000 and go up. And any rate, the drop on demand now is just as good as the continuous inkjet. They've got the technology that good. Next week, we are going to be talking about how cameras capture color.
Oh, fun.
And we're going to be talking about how do we shoot accurate color with our cameras or pleasing color. And that's where we're going to be going next week, and that'll complete our 4 shows connected with color.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm sorry to be coming in the middle of your color series. I should have started at the very beginning. I'm going to have to go back. I did hear some of last week's, but, not sitting in and actually hearing it firsthand. I'm going to have to go back, but I'm excited.
Now, on a regular basis, are we going to be the science twins?
We're gonna see. Leo's trying some new things out. He,
Okay.
science twin powers activate. Be good.
Right.
Yeah, it's Science Thursday, and on days that Leo needs to get some other business taken care of, I'm going to have the power of the Twit Cottage cockpit, and we'll be helping to run things.
Super.
Yeah.
And
so I don't know. I don't know if this is going to be an all the time thing. We don't know that yet, and it all depends on how you enjoy it as well.
Well, I enjoyed it today. I look forward to it. Whichever way it goes, I'm completely happy.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited. So next week we're looking at color and cameras.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Ray.
All right.